Well, hello and welcome. My name is Lord HardThrasher, Quartermaster General to the Worshipful Guild of Defenestrators and Trampoline Salesmen, and the only aristocrat in England yet to sign their soul over to the National Trust. My bloody-mindedness does mean that instead of being handed around my own home by herds of the great unwashed, desperately seeking the tea rooms and the gift shop, I can instead consider myself master of my own space and my own soul. It does, however, have one or two downsides, including rather stretching one's finances. Particularly as Her Ladyship's Spanish golf coach, Her Ladyship's Italian horse riding instructor, and Her Ladyship's gruff Yorkshire undergardener don't come cheap. Whilst I would happily fire all of them, ideally from an ornamental cannon on the front lawn, that risks making Her Ladyship unhappy. And when Her Ladyship is unhappy, Jenkins becomes unhappy. And when Her Ladyship and Jenkins are unhappy, then my life is not worth living. Therefore, I discuss history on the internet with like-minded nerds like your good self. If you wish to support me and ensure Her Ladyship is happy on a regular basis, then please could you do me the enormous favour of clicking on the thumbs up button and the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this and you feel that you've enjoyed it sufficiently, then maybe consider becoming one of my patrons or buying something from the gift shop on your way out. Rank consumerism and begging completed, let us turn to the subject for today, a continuation of the Forgotten War series and the campaign in Burma. Roll credits. Even if I say so myself, I'm pretty pleased with that. Right. Before you go, what the is an Arakan? Let me quickly explain. You do not need to have watched the previous episodes in this series, but if you want to, you might want to go and have a look at the background. You'll find links in the description to see what we've talked about before. I'll do a quick recap in a second. Today we are planning to turn our faces to the wind and cover the farce that was the British attempt to re-invade Burma in 1942-43, and what became known as the First Arakan Campaign. And then, because frankly I can only watch so many things go wrong for the British without spilling my tea, we will go on to examine how Bill Slim and his army began to, as the youth say today, get good. So, a quick recap then. In the previous two episodes, we saw how the war in Southeast Asia had built up and begun in December of 1941, and then over the subsequent 5 months, how the British, Indian, Chinese and Commonwealth forces had been ejected from Burma by the highly professional, highly effective Japanese force. We discussed how Slim had managed to bring back a functional army out of a highly chaotic fight, whilst the Chinese forces had essentially been routed and sent back over the mountains into their homeland. We also acknowledged that, despite London wailing and gnashing their teeth, this was primarily as a result of chronic underinvestment in Burma for 20-odd years beforehand, and it shouldn't have come as a galloping shock that what little defences were in country were rapidly pushed to one side. As we discussed previously, the United States had got it into its little head that the Chinese, in the form of Chiang Kai-shek and his death squad's natty uniforms and fascist ideals, were in fact a democracy just waiting to burst out, and all they needed was some encouragement in the form of massive amounts of supplies to his army. Sadly, they also sent Joe Stilwell, which, well, it wasn't going great. In command in the theatre, for the British anyway, was General Wavell, and both Washington and London were trying to persuade him to re-invade Burma PDQ, but not at all for the same reasons. The Americans had hoped to open the Burma Road as fast as they could to get supplies to Chiang, whilst the British were hoping to use Burma as a jumping-off point to reclaim Singapore and Malaya. The only thing the two capitals really agreed on was that Burma was at the bottom of a very long list of places that supplies needed to go. So let's start this episode with a quick discussion on Wavell. He was, and he remains, an incredibly hard man to read. He's a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character in the India and Burma story. On the one hand, there's Good Wavell, the man who put Punch Cowan in charge at a critical moment in the retreat from the Setang, who ordered the 7th Armour Brigade to divert to Rangoon just in time, who correctly diagnosed Japanese intentions during the fighting for central Burma, and had the foresight to lobby London for a clear directive to retreat back into India. But then there's his evil twin, Bad Wavell, the man who so often failed to see the blindingly bloody obvious. For example, that arguing that Rangoon could become the Tobruk of the Southeast Asia was completely mad. He was the man that got out the wrong side of his damn staff car, for God's sakes. Bad Wavell was the twat who pissed the Chinese off at exactly the wrong moment. Bad Wavell who had no sense of what his own troops were feeling, and Bad Wavell who, as we are about to see, promoted some of the absolute Charlies in his army into positions of power. Unfortunately, for most of 1942 and a good chunk of 1943, Bad Wavell got the upper hand in the decision-making, kicking off a series of disastrous decisions for about the next 18 months. To start Bad Wavell's string of stupidity, just as Burma Corps struggled back into India after their epic march at the end of May, he fired their commander, General Bill Slim, and moved him to command 15th Corps in Chittagong. And this was not great. But then Bad Wavell made probably the worst decision of his entire life, bringing in a new commander for Eastern Army to become Slim's boss, and we will look at him in a second. The reception of the troops when they arrived bedraggled over the border into India was pretty bloody awful at the end of May. Half-starved, diseased, bedraggled, having walked over 900 miles and fought multiple battles against heavy odds, what they expected was food, shelter and medical care. Slim later said that half of them should have been sent straight to a soft hospital bed. What they got, in fact, was canvas, if they were lucky, and half rations because of the supply situation. It was, to put it mildly, a fucking letdown. The hospital in Imphal had 4,000 men, and in it just 5 nurses. Beriberi, typhus, malaria, ulcers, lice, and much more besides was rampant. Many men simply lay down in the mud and died. Those who were still on their feet were told to dig in and await a probable Japanese attack. Quite how they were supposed to fight it off was not made at all clear to them. As Slim put it years later, preparations should have started months beforehand, and it was inexcusable that nothing had been done. Bad Wavell had taken over, and nothing was ready. No serious thought had been put into what would happen next to these troops who were, despite their emaciated and disease-ridden nature, still the only thing stopping the Japanese from marching into India, and still a recognisable military force, just about. If they were given some rest and some supplies, they could rebuild their strength. What they got was altogether different. And so it was in July of 1942, the lucky, oh so lucky, so lucky Eastern Army got, drumroll please, Major General Noel Irwin, one of the least capable commanders in the entire British Army for the whole of the Second World War, and in a field that includes Bernard Bloody Freyberg, the man who lost Crete and bombed Monte Cassino for no reason. This is a pretty bold statement, but walk with me a while and see what you think. Irwin had gathered unto himself many glowing recommendations over many years. He was, in fact, the very embodiment of what is beginning to become a bit of a running theme in this series, to wit a hugely brave individual with the intellectual horsepower of a stuffed toy, and a well of insecurity so deep that a stone dropped into it would never stop falling. Winner in the First War of the Military Cross, repeatedly mentioned in dispatches, twice winner of a DSO, which is no bloody mean feat because most of those come posthumously, and the holder of the French Cross de Guerre, he had guts, no doubt. But this war had been a lot less kind. In a very short space of time, he'd had to retreat ignominiously twice, first at Dunkirk, where he'd led 6th Infantry Brigade out, and then in Dakar, where he was caught up in one of Charles de Gaulle's idiotic plans to retake part of the former French Empire, which, despite Charles saying, "Fear not, they are all bon Frenchmen and totally democratic, oui oui," actually it turned out the local regime was in fact full of complete fascists loyal to Pétain, who'd rather apply for a British passport than let Charles de Gaulle take over. Suffice to say, shooting had started, and everybody had run back to Blighty as fast as the destroyers could carry them. Thus, Irwin's otherwise spotless military record had become a little tarnished, and now that he'd been posted to what he considered to be a backwater of failure, he was looking to make some changes. For a chap like Irwin, who viewed the army as a political game in which he needed to toady up to his superiors whilst crushing his subordinates lest they take his job, it was barely worthy of him. As a product of the British Army, not the Indian Army, he looked down on the sepoy generals in Delhi. As far as he was concerned, Indian Army officers were lesser, inferior beings. They'd gone native and did gods alone knew what in the bazaars of the Raj. Irwin was not the sort of man to be sitting there drinking a pink gin on the veranda, admiring Mughal architecture, not when he could be standing over his Batman as his underpants were starched. And that all meant in his mind that whilst 6th Infantry Brigade came out of Dunkirk with its heads held high as heroes with their weapons and a fine body of men worthy of respect, the men of the Indian Army trudging out of Burma were a contemptible rabble that needed discipline and a firm hand, not soft beds and medicine. Not that he saw many of them come out. In fact, he watched for a couple of days as the rear echelon staff appeared, and didn't wait to greet the actually fighting troops at all before running back to Calcutta, utterly convinced that his new command was totally worthless. With all the grace of a hippo ice skating, Irwin began to reorganise his army in his own image, so that he would be ready to throw these silly little yellow Japanese out of Burma in just a few weeks of fighting. Believing, as he did, that the sepoy generals were effete losers who were little better than colonial police in uniforms, he immediately made it his business to fire them all and bring in his buddies from the British Army. You know, the British Army that had just had its arse kicked in Norway, France and North Africa. Yeah, that one. Naturally, this included Slim being shunted out of the way. Actually, this especially included Slim being shunted out of the way. It turned out that whilst Irwin had a brain the size of a walnut, it did have space enough within it to hold a grudge and to be paranoid. Slim had done two completely unforgivable things. Firstly, and most obviously, he'd been widely lauded as the man that managed to bring Burma Corps out of Burma as a fighting unit, and this threatened Irwin's fragile ego. And second, oh god. See, it turned out that when Slim had been in command in Abyssinia in 1940, Essex Regiment had broken and run in the face of an Italian air raid, and Slim had promptly sacked its commanding officer. Problem was, this turned out to be Irwin's brother-in-law. Awkward! Although you may have been watching this and perhaps concluding that I may possibly somehow come to a slight judgment about Irwin, I actually came into all of this with a very open mind. I did my level best to see his point of view, but every time I look at anything that he actually did, it turns out his rampant insecurities and sense of entitlement stop any human sympathy one might have for him and make me want to knock his front teeth out. When Slim, with his army, had finally staggered back across the border, he found his new commander dismissive of Burma Corps' plight and downright rude, and he said so. Irwin's response was, "I can't be rude, I'm superior." Oh, do f*** off. This arrogance and stupidity was only the start of the problems, because this pompous arse was also an obsessive micromanager, often a sign of somebody who is singularly ill-suited for leadership, and insisted on involving himself in stuff well below his pay grade, trusting no one to get on with the job at hand. This clear lack of self-confidence manifested itself in particularly unpleasant strains of pettiness and a determination to bring down anyone who might threaten his ego. He displayed a pathological insistence that all of his subordinates obey his every order and command, without question, no matter how stupid or petty or pointless, seeing even mild questioning as gross insubordination. Equally, he was completely unable to question commands given by his own superiors, even if they made no sense on the ground, and this meant that he was always highly strung, overworked, and irritable. In short, it's hard to imagine somebody less well adjusted to the rigours and demands of this far-flung, often under-resourced and highly changeable front. Of all bad Wavell's questionable decisions, the appointment of Irwin may be amongst his most egregious. The two men, Irwin and Wavell, managed to make a very difficult situation with the Americans immeasurably worse at almost every turn. In 1942, there were huge tensions between the two camps. The Americans could never quite believe that the British weren't there just to recover their lost empire, and nor could they believe that the British truly wanted to fight the Japanese. The British, on the other hand, were never completely convinced about the concept of supporting China at all costs. They didn't really believe that it had any strategic value, recognising, probably correctly as it turned out, that the Chinese were really far more concerned with fighting one another than they were with fighting the Japanese in the grand geostrategic world view. Moreover, the Americans came up with some frankly bonkers plans to try and drive a new road from India through the Himalayas and into China. This consumed vast resources, including about 30,000 US engineers and 150,000 local labourers. In the end, this road was completed, but only as Japan surrendered. The road itself was used for about a month, right at the end of the war. In the end, the US really focused primarily on flying supplies in over the mountains, which became known as the Hump Route. These strategic differences were never fully resolved during the entire course of the war, or indeed actually post-war, and even today, many Americans speak about the British as though they were only there to recover their colonies, which is a bit frustrating given that the whole plan by 1943 was to move towards independence for both India and Burma as quickly as possible post-war. A bit like the Wicked Witch of Snow White fame in front of her mirror asking for confirmation of her beauty, during much of 1942, Bad Wavell would stand in front of his map table in New Delhi and mutter to himself, "Think how stretched they must be. If I had one division ready, I'd go for them now." His staff, in a case of working towards Archie, would come up with plans. Big plans: strike north across Burma, retake the whole of the north in one fell swoop, reopen the Burma Road, capture Mandalay and drive, quote, "the little yellow buggers," unquote, south. They came up with plans to send a massive flotilla of naval landing craft down the coast of the Bay of Bengal and retake Rangoon by main force. They came up with plans to do both at once. They dreamt of parachute and glider-borne attacks to seize back the oil fields of Yangyar. Each of these plans was considered in turn by London and deemed either not ambitious enough or enough to cause the Mandarins in Whitehall to shit themselves at the resources required and go back to busily not quite invading Europe. The Germany First policy ruled with an iron fist for the British and, as it turned out, for the Americans too. The view that the British just wouldn't fight meant a much reduced supply of kit from America into the region, and it wasn't helped by our friend Joe Stilwell and his reports home. Famously, during one conference between Wavell and Stilwell about offensive operations, the British general asked the American, "Are you satisfied that this offensive is impossible?" "Why, yes," said Stilwell. "Are you satisfied that we have explored all alternatives?" "Yes." "Then what will you tell the Chinese?" "I'll tell them the British won't fight." Fucking prick. Anyway, so having looked all over for an objective that might fit into the Goldilocks zones of not so big that it was beyond Eastern Army's capabilities, but not so small as to piss Churchill off even more than he already was, the collective geniuses of Army HQ Delhi came up with the biggest small objective that they thought that they could go for. The challenge was how and where. With no roads connecting India with Burma to speak of, supply would have to come in by sea, which meant a coastal target. Moreover, it needed to be in range of the limited fighter cover, "Mallory, you bellend, give us the goddamn Spitfires," and ideally be close enough to India that you could put a road in behind the advance to supply the troops. Thus, searching eyes landed on the coastal town of Akiab at the end of the 90-mile Mayu Peninsula in a region commonly known as the Arakan. Grab that spit of land and Akiab and maybe you could use it as a jumping off point for operations into Burma or a seaborne invasion of Rangoon or maybe the entire world, man. All right. Settle down, people, settle down. I know this is your favourite segment of things where HardThrasher does a geography bloody lesson, but shut up and listen in or I'll make Jenkins encourage you. This map is a map of the region we're going to be talking about today, and you need to pay attention because it wasn't sodding cheap. Up the top left here is the city of Chittagong in India. If we follow the road down the coast, we get to a place called Cox's Bazaar, no sniggering at the back, and the jumping off point for the offensives to come, and also the primary British supply dump. If we follow this road marked on the map a little further south, we'll go over the border to a place called Barley Bazaar. The term road here is doing a hell of a lot of heavy lifting and perhaps giving you an unfair view of what we're talking about. This is not something with a bunch of asphalt, white lines, curbstones and cat's eyes. No, this is essentially a track. A glorified track, maybe with a bit of hardcore underneath it. That's about it. In the monsoon period, it's going to be a raging storm of mud, and in the summer, it's just going to kick up an absolute fuck ton of dust and tell the Japanese exactly where you are and how many people are coming. There are a few things which may jump out at you about the Mayu Peninsula in particular. Like so much of Burma, there are some bloody great big hills in the sodding way the whole time. In this case, the Mayu Range, which go down the spine of the proposed ground, meaning that basically you need two operations for the price of one. A pretty shitty deal when you're trying to lead a force that could be cut off on the wrong side at any moment. But on the other hand, if those hills could be labelled as impassable by some walla in Delhi, then presumably the Japanese will do the same thing and it will all go fine. Yeah, probably. They are about 2,000 feet up, they are covered in jungle, there are almost no tracks, so sure, impenetrable it is. Oh, and this is Burma, so of course there are rivers all over the place to further complicate your room for manoeuvre or act as defensive barriers depending on one's perspective. Inland is the Kaladan River, which we can probably ignore mostly for now, beyond noting that if there was an interdicting force of any kind coming from central Burma for any reason, they'd need to cross it. He says, foreshadowing. And then you've got the Mayu River itself. For reasons best known to cartographers and Gordon's London gin, it's called the Kalapanzi River in its upper reaches and the Mayu in its lower reaches. Life is too short, we're going to call it the Mayu. Okay, good, excellent. Being directly connected to the sea, the Mayu is tidal for most of its length, which means it gets deeper and wider on a regular basis. It's mostly banked by swamps and mangroves, and excitingly for the infantry, it therefore floods thousands and thousands of tiny weeny little sub-rivers called chungs. This makes it an absolute arsehole of a place to fight over. So, if one wished to ambush an advancing force, or frankly just sit on top of a hill and laugh at them getting bogged down, it would be child's play. On the banks of this interesting river is the wee town of Buthidang, and opposite on the seaward side is the town of Mongdor. These two towns were connected by the only road that could be described as motorable that crossed the Mayu Range, which is Burmese for mud bath in the monsoon, but if you're feeling brave in the summer you can try it. Passing through a pair of tunnels, it was extremely vulnerable, so getting to it and holding it would be vital for any and all future operations. If you subsequently lost that road, he says carefully, then you'd have your forces cut in half where they could be destroyed in detail. Good job those hills are impenetrable though, eh? This map makes it look like there are other roads around the place. Spoilers, there aren't. Or at least not ones you could use for vehicles and not ones you'd really want to even try on foot. So if you're the British and Indian Army in 1942 and your whole supply network is based on motor transport, this is a bit of a fucking problem. About halfway down is the village of Indian, and almost at the end is the small fishing village of Donbaik, and at the very, very bottom of the Mayu Peninsula, just before you get to Akiab, is a place called Foul Point. When the poor sod doing the cartography puts a name on a place like this, for example, I don't know, Death Valley or Bloodbath Hills or whatever, one should probably stop to think about why they might have done that. But no one did, and Foul Point was the first objective. The more observant amongst you may also have noticed that Akiab is not actually on this peninsula, so some kind of a naval operation would be required were one to take Foul Point before you could take Akiab. No matter, the Royal Navy will doubtless have plenty of landing craft for us to borrow, so that will be fine, I'm sure. My beautiful map, which cost me a mere £35 from the twats at Alimony, who claim to own the fucking thing but clearly don't, doesn't show you one or two other things in the region that the infantry would shortly discover. To wit, it is a malaria-infested hellhole filled by more varieties of venomous snakes than any other place on Earth, which, given the existence of Australia, is quite the claim to fame. It was also, in 1942 and 43, in the middle of its own little internecine war between the Muslim Rohingyas and the Buddhist Burmese, with the Japanese standing somewhat bemused on top of it all, adding a certain spice to proceedings. So as other strategic options disappeared down the U-bend of an impossibly long supply chain and the bog brush of inevitable reprioritisation did its work to the toilet bowl of grand sweeping strategy, all that was really left was the toilet bleach and tonic of the Arakan. Alright, geography lesson over. I'll flash this up again as we need it, but the key names right now are Mongdor and Buthidung because of that road, Indian and Donbaik, and we'll come to the rest later on. Slim was becoming aware of the fact that the planning staff in Delhi were engaging what might be kindly called acts of collective delusion, and so he decided that since his 15th Corps faced the peninsula, they would probably be coming to him sooner or later to put a plan into action with whatever that meant. So looking at his available resources, Slim wasn't particularly enamoured with all of his options, but figured that 14th Division under Lloyd was closest and thus logically should probably take the lead. Slim realised that whatever they did, speed, innovation, manoeuvre and operational flexibility were absolutely key. The Japanese needed to be kept guessing and he needed to be able to quickly shift the emphasis of his attack to different points to prevent the Japanese from digging in or concentrating their forces. And to this end then, he began to work up a training plan with Lloyd to equip his forces with all the skills that they would need to bypass Japanese strongpoints, move along the jungle quickly and lightly, and operate both by day and night no matter what the weather was. Looking at the Mayu Peninsula, Slim decided that a frontal assault was just stupid, and so he needed other options. He also knew that no one was going to help him, so he needed to come up with goods himself. Fortunately, he had a cunning plan. After the retreat and his banishment to Bengal, Slim had realised that the Japanese might well use the plethora of rivers on the Bengal coast to attack from the sea, and much as they'd done during the retreat, perhaps use the rivers that went inland to circumvent any concentrations of troops. To that end, then, he had requisitioned a number of small boats, and by affixing them with whatever weapons he had lying around, from Bofors guns to Bren guns, he built up a force of what might loosely be called patrol boats, skippered and crewed by Indian pilots. Now, looking at the Arakan proposal, and knowing that he'd never get any boats out of the Royal Navy, much less the US Navy, he decided to press them into alternative service, whilst also recruiting a nice young chap called Ord Wingate. Slim's plan was three-pronged. The 14th Division would go up front straight down the peninsula, moving as fast as they could and applying pressure to the Japanese to hold them in place. Meanwhile, he'd take the bulk of 15th Corps in a series of short hooks on his wee boats and come up behind any Japanese strongpoints, assaulting them from behind or simply just cutting them off. 14th Division was ordered to bypass any strongpoints as quickly as they could and let them wither on the vine. The Japanese could essentially stay where they were and starve to death, or piss off back to central Burma. Meanwhile, he'd send Ord Wingate's mob in to disrupt any moves that the Japanese might be making to reinforce the area, striking down the Caladan River Valley to cause mischief and mayhem should they try and move troops in from elsewhere. The Japanese could then elect to stay in place, dying by 1,000 cuts, or they could just give him the peninsula. Supply was going to be a problem for sure, but Slim reckoned that a combination of air support, leveraging his rivercraft, and extensive use of mules would bypass the road issues for long enough to get the job done. He estimated somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks of fighting, to start as soon as the monsoon was over. But Irwin had other plans. Well, actually, he didn't. What he did have was a plan for Slim, and that was to keep him as far away from the fighting as he possibly could. In a move that was to come as a profound shock both to 15th Corps and to the Eastern Army in general, Irwin moved Slim to a training post in Ranchi, there to be responsible solely for preparing the rest of the Eastern Army for future operations. Irwin himself would take over 15th Corps and run the battle. This was an inauspicious start, and it rapidly got worse. Irwin looked at Slim's plan and immediately decided to abandon any use of Slim's river flotilla. Having never enjoyed the delights of being at the arse end of everyone else's priority list, Irwin made the cardinal error of believing that when the Royal Navy said that they'd be able to support his landings at Akiab, they would, support his landings at Akiab. In fact, what the Royal Navy meant was, yes, we'd be delighted to support your landings, provided you're planning to land in Tunisia in about 4 months' time, and promptly fucked off back to Europe with all of their boats. Irwin was a bit concerned, but Bad Wavell ordered him to do the Mayo Peninsula assault anyway, and Irwin wasn't the kind of man to ever question orders, no matter how stupid they were, so he pushed on. And this put Irwin in a bit of a tricky spot, as up to that point he had been planning to use the landing craft to rapidly capture Akiab and then work back up the peninsula so that he would be able to capture the range from below. Now, that's not a shit idea, but without the boats this was no longer possible. But then Bad Wavell struck again, this time by taking away Ord Wingate's 77th Infantry Brigade, which as we'd observed was there to interdict any reinforcement. These guys, more commonly known today as the Chindits, were actually sent off to go and support a proposed American thrust down the Burma Road that never materialised. If I'm completely honest, I don't really know why this happened, because the American thrust was cancelled before this operation began, and Wingate should have been ordered to support it. But he wasn't, and it's completely inexplicable to me. Maybe somebody else knows. If you do, please put a comment below. I'd be fascinated to find out. If this move to get rid of the Chindits was a problem for Irwin, he didn't say anything to anybody, and I think the reality is, as a British Army officer, he just wasn't used to fighting with irregulars, and he didn't see it as a problem. And this rather narrowed the whole thing down to a frontal assault, the idea that Slim had considered to be bloody stupid, because it was, and to this not very clever idea, Irwin then wedded the idea of building a road behind his advance to bring up supplies, meaning he could only move very, very slowly. Still, he had 2 divisions against an assumed enemy force of maybe 3,600 widely dispersed troops. Should be an absolute doddle. Careful planning, sure, slow, steady, wins the day. Nothing too showy, and best of all, no sodding boats and no sodding irregular operations, just a fuck ton of artillery. Just like the good old days of 1918. How hard could it be? Yeah, it turned out pretty bloody hard, actually. Irwin may have been a petty, insecure, arrogant, and a martinet, but he was not a complete idiot. He had learnt various important lessons about how one takes ground, supports troops, and moves forward. Unfortunately, the lessons that he'd learned had come to him in France in 1917, and he was trying to apply them to Burma in 1942. First up, like all good generals, was the need for training. The challenge with looking at commanders is quite often they come up with gnomic wonders, like, the key to success is training, and you and I as amateurs look at this and go, well, no shit, Sherlock. The trick is really understanding what that training consists of and why you're going to go about trying to do it. And as much fun as regimental sergeant majors have always had firing their shiny new Vickers machine guns over the head of terrified recruits, you do need a system of training that's relevant to the troops' probable operating environment, and not, say, training your troops to fight on the Western Front in World War I whilst stood in Burma 20 years later. Ergo, Irwin's insistence that training wasn't about speed, cutting off the enemy or going around strong points, but was about artillery, slow build-ups, and head-on attacks was both fairly pointless and took a lot of time. In fact, everything was taking time. Bringing 14th Division together took time. Building the road took time. The training was taking time. The monsoon was taking far longer than anybody had expected to finish, which meant it was taking time. And meanwhile, London kept shouting for action, and the Americans kept thinking that the Limeys were cowards. And Irwin's tarnished record wasn't really being topped by a glorious victory as fast as he needed it to be. So eventually, in September of 1942, 6 months after the British had been ejected so ignominiously from Burma, the advance did begin, and then immediately stopped. Firstly, the slurry of mud, churning chunks filled with water, constant landslides and disease made the road building next to impossible, reducing Lloyd's advance to an absolute crawl. And then the Japanese turned up, thinking that they would add to the fun and put in a few scattered attacks before disappearing off again, leaving bits of captured British and Indian troops nailed to various trees in their wake. This all conspired to stop everything dead in its tracks, and after 3 months of delay, things did finally get going again. Meanwhile, General Aida, who for all his flaws was not a moron, realised that the British were indeed up to something in the Arakan and began to move his forces from central Burma to the east, there to await developments. This was not an easy feat, but fortunately for him, the British were moving so slowly it gave him all the time in the world. Restarting his advance in early December, Irwin's forces made great gains down the peninsula pretty rapidly, the Japanese having apparently melted away before them. By the 6th of January 1943, they'd reached the small village of Donbaik, lying between the Mayu Hills and the sea, the one we looked at earlier on the map. In command of the tiny garrison of Japanese in Donbaik was one Colonel Koda of the 15th Division. Although hugely outnumbered by the advancing British, he had been given months to prepare thanks to Irwin's ponderous movements and a clear understanding of the line of British advance thanks to Irwin's utter lack of imagination. Knowing Aida was sending more troops over, all Koda needed to do was to hold on as long as he could and await relief. Based on his hard-won experience in China, he built a series of 7 deep and carefully sited bunkers made of logs, covering them with leaves and camouflaging them perfectly. These were sited to create kill zones of interlocking fire, covering every approach and using the 9-foot deep chung as an anti-vehicle ditch. Added to this were a series of dummy bunkers to draw enemy fire and effort, and a network of tunnels connecting the troops and bunkers to the reverse slope of positions where they could hide and shelter from artillery fire. The British were stopped dead. Multiple assaults went in straight at Donbaik, straight at Koda's position. In scenes that their fathers would have recognised from the Western Front, creeping barrages followed by infantry advances were repeated time after time to no effect. The Japanese grew stronger with each passing day. The log bunkers, unlike the concrete ones, meant that artillery fire was dissipated and not concentrated, and they were almost impervious to anything but direct hits through the front aperture, something not possible with plunging artillery fire. And like some of the generals from the previous war, Irwin became convinced that he just needed to put in more concentration of force, more firepower, more troops, just one more push. He wanted to go through, not around these positions. The courage of the Japanese troops here defies all imagination. Single soldiers, wounded and with no hope of assistance, would man their guns until the bitter end. Squads holding bunkers would hide on the reverse slopes when the artillery was bombarding their bunkers, and then, as the British began to shift their fire, would rush back to their positions and open fire on the advancing British and Indian troops, throwing them back, time after time after time. At no point did it occur to Irwin to look at the lessons which had been learnt during the retreat, either from what the Japanese had been doing to the British, or indeed from what the commanders who'd been on the ground had learnt at the time. At no point did it cross his mind that he might be wrong. Throughout January, Irwin ordered Lloyd to attack, each time straight down the middle and each time with the same result. Meanwhile, reconnaissance showed that the Japanese were moving troops into the area, although exactly where they were concentrating wasn't clear, and time was running out before the rains would return. Finally, Irwin decided to try some tanks, calling on all of them. No, the other thing, calling for a single troop of them, just 9 Valentines. Slim, along with his armour commander back in Ranchi, was absolutely horrified and found himself compelled to write to Irwin with the phrase, "The more you use, the less you lose," in a letter. Irwin rejected this advice and reprimanded Slim for putting his nose in where it wasn't wanted. Another attack went in during early February, and of the 9 tanks, 6 were duly knocked out to no discernible effect. Deciding more power was necessary, 6th Brigade was ordered in to give more oomph, but this just added to the confusion and the unwieldiness of an already compressed fighting force stuck between the hills and the sea. And then to compound this mistake, both 71st Indian Infantry Brigade was added, and then elements of 26th Indian Division were thrown in on the 25th. There were now 3.5 divisions involved in a glorified beach fight, and not a single one of them was up on the hills. By the end of February, it was clear that it hadn't worked, and that it couldn't work before the monsoon came. Meanwhile, back in Delhi, Bad Wavell heard about this decision, absolutely shit a brick, and ordered Irwin to reverse his orders to Lloyd, and in full General Melchett style, ordered, quote, "a morale-building assault for as soon as possible." By this point, the men on the peninsula and the British and Indian Army were exhausted and dying of disease at the rate of 50 a day. More than 80% of them had malaria. British and Indian dead littered the landscape. The idea of assaulting again was beyond many, and they came close to breaking. Irwin decided that this was all Lloyd's fault, and after writing a series of highly critical letters to Wavell about the quality of his troops and their commanders, took over planning and attack directly. In effect, what he was announcing to all and sundry was that he'd lost faith in the commander on the ground. He went up to the front, sat like some shit version of Buddha on a hill for literally 30 minutes, and came up with a plan that no one had ever seen before. Oh no, wait, no, he came up with another frontal assault. Only the difference this time was he was going to narrow the objective and simply try and take the first few bunkers. He did at least schedule an airstrike to support his attack, which I guess is a good thing, asking the RAF to send in their Blenheim bombers from Dum Dum Airfield on the appointed day, which was picked out as the 18th of March 1943. In a move which, on the surface of things, might seem strange, 8 days beforehand, on the 10th of March, Irwin ordered Slim to come out to the Arakan and see what was going on. Slim not unreasonably asked if he should bring his HQ staff with him and prepare to take over, but Irwin declined. Slim's spidey senses kicked in. This was a political trap if ever there was one. If Slim went out there, reported all that was fine, and then the attack failed, as clearly Irwin thought it might, then Slim could be blamed for failing to provide proper advice. If, on the other hand, the attack worked, then Slim's input could safely be written out of the record books. If, on the other hand, Slim expressed a lack of confidence in the plan, then this gave Irwin the excuse to go and talk to Wavell and say perhaps the attack shouldn't go in. And should Wavell push back on that idea, then Slim was right there to blame for having come up with it in the first place. This was a truly shitty wicket. But Slim was a man far more interested in winning and protecting his men's lives than he was about trying to win a political fight, so he took the poisoned chalice without demur and flew out to the Arakan. Slim was absolutely shocked about what he found there. The troops were demoralised, badly trained. A later report would describe them as little more than armed village youth. Their fire discipline was non-existent, rates of disease were crippling, medical care was minimal to non-existent. The only thing that was working was getting rations and ammo up to the front, which at least meant the troops weren't starving and could shoot. The problems at command were just as bad. 9 brigades were stuffed onto the peninsula with no proper core HQ, and the plan was stupid and unimaginative. No one had tried to use the jungle to flank the enemy, much less get up into the hills, which Slim urged them to try and saw as a critical error. He reported this much to Irwin in Calcutta and was then ordered to return to his post in Barrackpore. The attack went in on the 18th, the Blenheims missed, the men were mown down, and there were no gains. Some 300 dead were left in front of the Japanese positions, adding to the rotting corpses of previous assaults. Irwin, clearly out of ideas, ordered everyone to stay where they were on the 20th of March, making a virtue out of doing fuck all. General Aida, presumably between fits of laughter, was doing some planning of his own. Now, with a considerable force at his disposal, and with the British apparently obsessed by a small fishing village on the coast, he began to put his troops into the top of the hills between the British forces and the valley below. By the 24th of March, the Japanese forward units had slipped unnoticed onto the high point of the Mayu Range, and 3 days later they had control over all of the high ground. Then, without warning, the British found a blocking force between their supply base at Indian and their attacking forces at Donbaik. The absolute shock of the British would be hard to describe, especially when they found that their precious Mungdor-Butidang road was under threat. Under attack and pressure from all sides, by the 29th of March, Lloyd had realised that the situation was useless and that they needed to pull back, issuing orders for an orderly retreat to Mongdor, there to dig in and see out the monsoon. In doing so, he knew that he was ignoring Irwin's order of the 20th. He figured he'd get fired, but by this point he didn't really care about anything except rescuing his troops from this obvious trap. Irwin predictably lost his shit, sacked Lloyd, and promoted the next in line, Lomax, to take over what was rapidly becoming a disastrous situation. To show how serious he was, Irwin flew to the front with his big boy pants on. Things then rapidly turned into a sort of Kafkaesque farce. Within 24 hours, Irwin himself was forced to issue exactly the same orders to retreat, only this time to try and save his face, he said that no one should move until the 10th of April, as if delaying the order would somehow help. Then, job done presumably, he got back on his plane and flew back to Calcutta, leaving Lomax in the lurch to manage the battle. Bad Wavell from Delhi now countermanded Irwin from distance and told Lomax instead to attack once more, but it didn't really matter because the Japanese by this point had cut the road. Lomax took one look at the orders coming in from Wavell and from Irwin and decided that he was going to suffer from a Guderian problem, that is, that he was going to studiously ignore incoming messages until the crisis had passed. He immediately ordered his embattled troops to extract themselves from what was rapidly becoming a death trap. He managed, somehow, to pull 6th Brigade out cleanly, but 47th Indian was cut off and effectively destroyed overnight. Irwin, instead of acknowledging that this was his mistake and that it had led to 47th's destruction, threatened to establish courts of inquiry to court-martial the surviving troops who'd managed to slip through Japanese lines. Despite what was becoming a complete rout, Irwin still wasn't willing to ask Slim for help, instead ordering him and his HQ staff to Chittagong, but not letting the staff get involved in the actual fighting in the Arakan. Things were disintegrating on the ground completely by this point. 6th Brigade's HQ was overrun and their brigadier was killed, but somehow they held on, if only by their fingertips. Finally, Slim, but only Slim and not his HQ staff, was allowed by Irwin to fly in and try and sort it out. Except Lomax was still in charge of everything and Irwin hadn't actually given Slim authority to do anything. It speaks well of both Lomax and Slim that by the 11th of May they had been able to extract the remaining troops, if not any of their heavy equipment, from a hellish situation, despite a concerted Japanese attempt to cut them off and destroy them, and the failure of several battalions to hold on to key ground at difficult moments. The exhausted British returned to their start lines, having lost 2,500 men to the fighting, and many, many more to the Burmese climate. Irwin's final days in command were no more edifying than his performance in battle. Having failed to tarnish Slim's reputation indirectly, he embarked on a series of frankly bizarre moves in private and public to blame Slim and everybody else remotely involved with the campaign. He signalled Wavell that Slim should be removed from command, and then he summoned Slim to his headquarters on the 21st of May. Slim thought this was probably curtains, and he told his staff as much. He thanked each one of them for their help, packed his bag, and prepared to go and get his P45. It was something of a shock then, when upon his arrival, Irwin turned round to him and said, "You're not sacked, I am." Slim signalled his staff back in Chittagong. "This calls for a bottle of port if we can find some." There are a lot of things to like about Slim as a commander. His ability to sit with junior NCOs and have a brew, his willingness to be open with his troops, to make a point of telling them the good, the bad and the ugly in regularly circulated reports, his ability to use both his head and his heart when fighting. But to me, at its core, it's his unflappability. He was a man who consistently faced the most brutal Japanese assaults and never panicked. He reacted fast but efficiently to each threat as it occurred, and who, over the years, was presented with different groups of staff officers, and instead of replacing them and bringing in his favourites, he made it his business to try and work with them to make himself and them better. He faced Irwin with a calm hand and an even keel, doing his job to the best of his ability, despite having a dickhead for a boss, because that would help win the war, because animosity from him to Irwin might get more of his boys killed. Well, okay, we could choose to stop there, but quite frankly, we've spent 3 episodes talking about how crap everything was in Burma for the first 18 months, and things are about to get good, so I'm keen to kind of kick on for a minute or two and talk to you about how things began to improve, and some stuff which I think, and I hope you'll find interesting. However, I'm conscious we've been here for quite a while. Jenkins needs to change the reel, so why don't we call this an interlude? Maybe go and visit the smallest room, or grab yourself a comfort biscuit. We'll be back in a second. After the Arakan, a shuffle at the top was inevitable. Fortunately, Ord Wingate's 77th Infantry Brigade, which if I sound tortured when I say that, is because I want to call it a division, and it wasn't, but anyway, let's move on, had the world's attention, so the changes could be addressed fairly quickly as they needed to be made. And Lord Lithgow, the inept and doddering Viceroy of India, was fired, with Wavell being booted upstairs into his seat in October. Into his former seat came a chap called Claude Auchinleck, fresh from being fired for fucking things up in the desert, just as Wavell had been before him, and another chap called General Gifford was brought in as theatre commander. Irwin, meanwhile, was dragged off like some villain at the end of a movie, and given the backwater of eastern Scotland to command for the rest of the war, and frankly, good riddance. Slim had, by this point, had time to properly think about what was going to be needed to retake Burma. Irwin's decision to banish Slim to a training position for the rest of Eastern Command meant that he'd actually been given time and space to consolidate his ideas and, crucially, to get to know pretty much every officer in the Eastern Army. Slim was therefore able to pick out his runners and riders, the men that he could rely on in the future, and indoctrinate them into his ways of thinking. He realised that there was a lot that needed fixing, from training to the use of air power, to working with Armour, to jungle familiarity, to strategic planning, to working with the Americans, to petitioning London for more of everything, and on and on and on and on. But at its heart, the challenge was one of morale. Writing years later, he said, "Morale is a state of mind. It is that intangible force which will move a whole group of men to give their last ounce to achieving something without counting the cost to themselves." But of course, to build up morale isn't and wasn't simple. Slim concluded that it was founded on 3 key principles. Number 1, spiritual. There must be an objective that is noble and that speaks to men's hearts more than their heads. Holding on for country or empire might help a bit, but really men needed to know that they were opposed to something that was evil and that they fought for good. As Slim put it in 1946, we had to stand for the clean, the decent, the free things of life, for the right to live our lives as others could live their lives, to worship God in whatever faith we chose, and goodness knows we had many faiths in that army, to be free in mind and body, and for our children to be free. Any man in 14th Army must feel this. This meant fundamental changes in culture and attitude in the Indian Army. It meant accepting independence and nationalism. It meant allowing, for example, Indian NCOs and Indian officers to command British and European troops. 2. Intellectual. Most troops need something greater than themselves to feel part of. Most individuals need something greater than themselves to feel part of, and an intellectual reason to be part of it. Objectives must be obtainable. The men needed to see that the army around them was pulling the same way as they were, as efficiently as it could, without the pettiness and bureaucracy that every army is prone to. Men must feel confidence in their leaders and know that their lives are not being wasted to no good purpose. Moreover, they must feel trusted. They need to know what's going on, good and bad, and be informed of everything insofar as is possible. They must feel like they're on the inside of the secret, not the outside. And absolutely, above all else, they must not feel ignored. Number 3, material. Slim felt this was the least important of the three, as he pointed out that men can do great things with very little if correctly motivated, but nonetheless it is important. At the very minimum, they must understand the limitations of what they could get, that self-reliance was essential and also admirable, but equally, whatever could be done was being done to see that they got good kit in quantity sufficient to be able to do the job, that they must be fed, that they must be clothed, and they must see that those things are happening. And no matter the difficulties, that everyone was getting the same, irrespective of class, rank, or race. To do these things, every man in the army had to see and know why they did what they did, and understand the impact if they failed. Everyone from the clerk in a lonely railway office miles from anywhere somewhere in the jungle, to a telephone operator at HQ, to a squaddie trying to have a smoke in the pissing monsoon. All of them needed to know why they were there, what they had to achieve, what the whole army was doing, that it was behind them, that their mates were there and relying on them, and that they all had to do a good job together. Okay, you might pick me up and go, that sounds great, but how do you go about doing it? Well, primarily this was really a combination of training, re-equipment, and then going out to go and speak to the men, all of them, directly himself or through his commanders. As the number of divisions in India grew from about 15 to 31 or so, and the number of RAF squadrons swelled to over 100, and as the roads and railways that were necessary for a campaign were laid, and as US Lend-Lease kit finally flowed into the region, Slim went out and spoke to his army. He spoke to them in English, in Urdu and in Gurkhali. He spoke to them in jungle clearings, in foxholes, at railway offices, at telephone switchboards. He spoke to the men laying roads and railways and toiling over heavy guns. He spoke to as many of them as he could, as frequently as he could, often talking 3 or 4 times in a single day. His message was simple and clear. The enemy could be beaten. He had a plan. He believed in this plan, and they should too. He would equip them. He would train them. They were strong enough to do this. He would lead them, and he expected his officers to do the same. In one account, Slim went to go and see a group of young officers freshly arrived from Britain into the theatre, and he spoke to them and said, "If you eat before your men have eaten, if you smoke before your men have smokes, if you sleep before you have made sure that your men can sleep, then I will come down on you like the fury of the Almighty himself. But if you do these things, then know I will always have your back, and we will win." It had a profound and galvanizing effect on the men, far from home, cut off from news, and facing an enemy who appeared to be implacable, barbaric, and so far had not been beaten, and many thought could not be beaten. But the Japanese could be, and the Aussies had proved it first. Initially, the Aussies had struggled like everybody else to beat the Japanese, but in September of 1942, they won the first decisive Allied land victory over the Japanese at Milne Bay on New Guinea. Slim strained every muscle to learn the lessons. Immediately, 2 Aussie officers flew into India and began to lecture training staff on the key lessons of Milne Bay, on the Kokoda Trail and Bloody Boona. In return, in October, 50 British officers went to Australia in a train-the-trainer scheme, attending the Kunganara Jungle Warfare School and then doing a tour on New Guinea with the Aussies. and 168 Australians were eventually dispatched into the Indian theatre over the next couple of years to serve with and instruct the British and Indian forces on what did and didn't work for jungle fighting. A lot of credit for this rapid change has to, somewhat surprisingly, go to good Wavell, who re-emerged at this point and began writing to General Thomas Blamey, the C&C of the Australian Army, and they exchanged voluminous letters on lessons learned and how they could be applied, showing none of the pomposity and condescension that had caused so much trouble back in 1942 with the Americans and the Chinese. And in August 1943, another stroke of luck landed in Slim's lap, specifically the selection as the Supreme Allied Commander for Southeast Asian Command of Lord Louis Mountbatten. This was a bit of a backroom deal. The Americans let the Brits take SAAC in exchange for having Dwight made up as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a seat that they wanted far more, and in so doing swallowed the fact that a lot of US flyers would suddenly be under British command. Of course, no one in Washington had the balls to tell Joe Stilwell that he now reported to a goddamn limey. We will come back to that in a second. Mountbatten was just 43 when he got the job. Some said that he was far too young, but in reality he had a wealth of experience. He was the King's cousin, a favourite of Churchill's, and someone who drove Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, utterly bonkers, all of which recommends him highly in my eyes. There were those who pointed out that he'd been the driving force behind the disastrous Dieppe raid, and like Churchill, he was prone to a quick win-wheeze, but he was in many ways an ideal appointment. Being well-connected, dashing and gallant, as well as personally brave, he was a completely different kind of commander from stuffy Wavell and Auchinleck, and his diplomatic abilities were perfect for a theatre which required multiple different voices, competing goals, and big personalities to be managed and mediated. Mountbatten met Slim for the first time shortly after he was appointed, and the two of them hit it off immediately. He offered Slim then and there command of the entire Eastern Army, not just a corps. Initially, Slim demurred, saying that Gifford and Auchinleck, who were his direct bosses, should be consulted, but Mountbatten simply pointed at his many, many rank badges and his uniform and said, "When I said I was Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, did I fucking stutter?" Or words to that effect. And so it was done. Slim was Army Commander and was allowed to rename Eastern Army 14th Army. Suddenly he was in a position to put his ideas into practice. One particular challenge was, of course, Joe Stilwell, the man wearing many hats, commander of US Forces Burma, Roosevelt's personal representative in the CBI theatre, the chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek. Mountbatten decided that the best way to tackle this problem was to get all of the SEAC commanders in one place so they could together give Stilwell the good news that he was reporting to the British. Stilwell conducted what Slim later referred to as a masterfully fluid defence. First claiming that he couldn't accept Mountbatten as his commander because Mountbatten had no authority over Chiang and Stilwell was Chiang's chief of staff, but equally he could not accept Auchinleck as the Auk was in charge of India only. After much back and forth, Stilwell gracefully gave ground by placing himself instead, somewhat bizarrely, at Slim's command in Burma because Stilwell was supposed to be in charge of US forces in Burma, of which, of course, there weren't any currently, but that didn't seem to worry anybody. By this point, everybody was so damn sick of his shit, they just went like, fuck it, Joe, sure, whatever. Meanwhile, other changes were afoot. Just a month before leaving his post, good Wavell had reappeared, and he'd established something called the Infantry Committee, which would be crucial to regenerating the army in India. After the retreat of 1942, a plethora of papers, advisory notes and local pamphlets had been distributed across the fighting formations, but without really any coordination. The Indian Army, unlike, say, the British Army or the US Army, or come to that, the German Army, had to fulfill multiple different kinds of roles, from crowd control to fighting full-on wars. It had to offer up divisions for service across the empire. It had to operate in mountains, in jungles, in hills, in deserts, in plains. It had to interlock with local customs and politics in a bewildering array of circumstances. And it had to operate with not a great deal of support or supply from the outside. As a result, a culture had grown up in which individual commanders in specific regions or specific formations created training to their own needs. One of the reasons that 17th Indian Division in Burma had performed so badly, for example, was that they weren't trained for the jungle, they'd been trained for desert operations. So when the retreat was over, basically each commander tried to draw their own lessons and implement them in their local area, leaving huge variance in the quality and relevance of training that was being provided. But the needs of a modern war meant that a centralised approach was absolutely essential, especially in an army which had gone from 190,000 in 1939 to well over 1 million by this point in the war and was picking up something like 50,000 new recruits a month. For 2 weeks, the infantry committee sifted through all of the evidence from the retreat and the Arakan and produced a list of recommendations which just so happened to pretty much exactly reflect what Slim had been doing with 15th Corps and in the Eastern Army training battalions. It's almost as if he helped write it or something. Anyway, this then became the driving force behind a top-down army-wide change. Battle drills were systematically developed to allow troops to respond in a series of intelligent, pre-prepared ways to all eventualities, from being ambushed to being shelled to advancing to contact to withdrawing in contact to air attack and so on and on and on and on. In a firefight, troops would know exactly what to do and when, and junior officers and NCO, whether European, African, Indian or Gurkha, could immediately act on contact with the enemy and be able to hold the initiative and be sure that the troops around them knew how to respond. And they would get, over the next few months, really, really good at it. A series of massively enlarged battle schools were established, capable of training all troops headed to a front. From cooks to cleaners to admin staff to generals, all were required to attend and pass. Everyone was now a combat soldier, capable of performing in contact with the enemy on the basis that being surrounded and cut off was inevitable, indeed desirable. These lessons were crystallised in something called the Military Training Pamphlet No. 9, which in its 4th edition became known as the Jungle Book. No, not that Jungle Book, this one. Yeah, okay, look, that cover is pretty racist, but it immediately engaged with the troops. On a distant front, handing paper out to the army had a positive morale effect, but perhaps only so far as the Privy Ditch. MTP9, however, was different. It was fun, practical, engaging and clear. Something like 80,000 copies were printed and distributed, and it provided an important part of training for all troops. Troop training as a whole was extended from 6 months to 11 months, and the process of feeding in replacements was overhauled, allowing experienced NCOs and replacements to train together in holding camps prior to joining units, which made the whole process of joining a new unit much, much smoother. Rations were improved and increased to 4,000 calories a day per man, irrespective of which of the 30 different ration scales men could eat. New jungle uniforms were issued, new kit began to flow into India, and it gained strategic purpose, in this case to retake Burma, that it had not previously had. Slim further laid down a series of rules for what he expected from his troops and their behaviours. As well as treating the jungle as something that was neutral, he explained that patrolling was key to controlling space within it, that the Japanese behind them was no reason to panic because it was off, that defensive boxes like those used in the desert were far better than thin lines and offered all-round protection, that surprise was key in the attack, that attacks should never be frontal if it could be avoided, that tanks could be used almost anywhere except swamp, and that holding the initiative was key to killing the Japanese. He didn't know it yet, but he only had a handful of months to try and get these changes, both cultural, moral, and physical, in place before it would face the severest of tests. Moving supplies up to the front was an insanely hard journey, requiring offloading at Bombay or Calcutta to a broad-gauge railway line which went up country. In turn, that would be offloaded to ferry across the Brahmaputra, reloading onto a narrow-gauge railway, which once again was offloaded to transfer to wheel transport, and then offloading again to move up towards Imphal on mules and porters. Wounded had to follow the same slow, horrifically bumpy route back down. Malaria victims in particular could take up to 4 months from evacuation to return, and the solution was twofold. Firstly, a new road, brick-built, going several hundred miles from the end of the railway lines up to Dimapur and then down through Kohima to Imphal and finally down to Tidim. To build this road, clay kilns were established every 10 miles and maintained, which meant that if there were landslides or slips, the road could quickly be repaired. Secondly, treating malaria far closer to the front. Something like 84% of troops that served on this front got malaria at some point. But by pushing the treating stations right behind the front and creating malaria protocols, like, for example, rolling your sleeves down after dark, and making sure that antimalarial drugs were taken by all ranks at all times, bore immediate fruit. Battalion commanders whose troops did not test over 90% for taking their drugs were sacked. Moreover, frontline medical units were directly connected with the US Army Air Force and RAF Transport Command to ensure that casualties could be swiftly triaged and extracted from forward locations. All of this massively improved morale and the fighting capabilities of the troops. The army, which had, as Slim had put it, been dissolving before our eyes, grew physically and mentally stronger with each passing day as a result. And meanwhile, the world's attention focused not on these quiet changes, nor indeed on the defeat in the Arakan, but instead on the endeavours of one Ord Windgate, commander of the 77th Infantry Brigade, or as he insisted they were called, the Chindits, and so it is to them we will turn next time. Well, come in, sit down, pour yourself something you would like and take a weight off. Thank you so much for getting to this point. We're going to leave Bill and his shiny new 14th Army there for now. But when we come back, we're going to look at the Indian National Army, the Burmese Independence Army, and the Chindits, as well as briefly looking at the Bengal famine that was ravaging the area in the summer of 1943. We will then circle round to the 1944 offensives by the Imperial Japanese Army as they reach the find out phase of proceedings. To do that, my plan is to take about 4 to 6 weeks to continue my research and write things up before I come back again with another 3 or 4 episodes, and then I'll take a short break and try and hit the advance proper into Burma in the new year, aiming to wrap everything up in around January, February next year. Easy peasy. Of course, no plan survives first contact with the whiskey bottle, and Jenkins may yet throw a spanner into my works by demanding, time off for Christmas or some shit, but we will see. All that remains for me to do here is to thank each of you sincerely for having made it to the end of a rather epic video and ask that perhaps you consider hitting the subscribe button. Oh, look at that, it lights up. We could do that again. Subscribe button. Yeah, cool, eh? Anyway. Or hitting like or leaving a comment. If you're feeling all racy, then all 3. If you've really enjoyed it, then Jenkins's Widows and Orphans Fund will gratefully receive your order and dispatch a mug or a sticker or something else in the post. This video has been made possible by my generous patrons. Seriously, I think I've bought around 300 quid's worth of books to do this, so thank you very much to them. I really couldn't have done it without them. And if you'd like to join these sexy mother lovers, then the details are on the screen now. Well, until next time then, sleep well, fair princes, princesses, and otherwise glamorous, and I will see you soon.